Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
The theologians have helped us a great deal in overcoming the splits and difficulties that have bothered us now for over 400 years since the Reformation in the 16th century. Protestants and Catholics have gone their own ways and largely been fighting with one another. Now, I think that today the theologians are serving us much better. They have taken the thorny issues, tried to discuss them thoroughly, and have come up with certain consensus statements on belief that both Protestants and Catholics could hold in common.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Jim Troutwine, Episcopal Chaplain at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the modern ecumenical movement. Here's Father Bacik.
Jim, we get a chance to talk on this program about important religious matters. I wonder if we couldn't speak a bit about the modern ecumenical movement, something that I know that you've been involved in to a great extent and have kept abreast of and know what is going on in that area. So I'd like to speak a little bit about ecumenism. I might start by sharing some of my own perceptions of it from the theological world. It seems to me that the theologians have helped us a great deal in overcoming the splits and difficulties that have bothered us now for over 400 years since the Reformation in the 16th century. Protestants and Catholics have gone their own ways and largely been fighting with one another. A lot of the seminary training amounted to defending one's own position against the opposition. I can remember studying in the seminary myself that way, where the theological textbooks centered on controversy. In the Catholic seminaries, we would learn how to refute the Protestant positions and so on. Now, I think that today the theologians are serving us much better. They have taken the thorny issues, tried to discuss them thoroughly, and have come up with certain consensus statements on belief that both Protestants and Catholics could hold in common. We've had these bilateral conferences and theologians spending years together discussing important issues like concepts of what baptism is and the ministry and what we understand about the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. They've even discussed things like infallibility and church authority and so on. And my perception is that they've done an excellent job. What they've shown us is that the controversies of the past often were misguided, that we really do have solutions to these problems. And when we quit fighting one another as Catholics and Protestants, we end up discovering a whole lot of common ground. I often say we've got something like 95% in common or maybe more. Very often I think if I'm in the right room with the right Episcopalian theologian or the right Lutheran or Presbyterian theologian, we find out that we have tremendous agreement. We have even common ways of saying things. Now, I suppose this knowledge is only gradually filtering down to the people in the pew, the average people in the church, but it is a tremendous service, I think. And I often, in dealing with couples, for example, that are getting married, and one of a Catholic background and one of Protestant background, I'm always suggesting to them that they examine this common ground, that so much they have together. They believe in the one God. They believe that Jesus is the Lord. They can say the Lord's Prayer together. They believe in the law of love of God and love of neighbor. They believe that there is a reward for people who live a good life. They're able to develop a prayer life together. They can read the Scriptures together. So much of that really held in common that can filter down at a very practical level. So I guess I feel that where theology really hurt the ecumenical movement for so many years, now in our own times, in the modern times, 20th century, and even in the past few decades, the people who are skilled in religious discourse have gotten together, talked it over, and really come up with these common consensus statements that show us how close we really are together. I often have the feeling that we could just about get united tomorrow if the people in the pews were open to it, and if the leaders at the top were ready to listen to what the theologians have said.
Well, I have to. That's quite a statement. There are three things in it that I think ought to be talked about further. I think probably you're right about the people in the pew. I wouldn't be surprised if they're not further along than the authority structure in terms of openness to each other. And perhaps some of their interests and concerns ought to be listened to a little more strongly than they have been. You mentioned the point of the theologians, and you said that if you were in the room with the right Episcopalian, Lutheran, Presbyterian theologian, you could feel a sense of almost instant unity. I think that what's happened in the field of theology has been not only the healing of old wounds, but also the opening of new ones. And they're not so obvious at the moment because the divisions in the new schools of thought do not correspond to denominational boundaries. They cut across those boundaries. And so you have people called progressive theologians, and they exist both in the Episcopalian or the Presbyterian or the Roman Catholic or the Lutheran or the Methodist and so on. You have conservative theologians, and they differ from others. So I don't think that the theologians are going to deliver us from difference of outlook or difference of viewpoint. One other thing,
before you move to your next point, Jim,
yes.
Let me just comment on it. I think you're absolutely right about that the new divisions are not along the old denominational lines. In other words, but to know that is helpful.
Oh, very much so.
In other words, we've overcome a lot of history there. We've gotten to the point where we say, well, Catholics don't have to be fighting against Lutherans. There really is a sort of common ground, and it's important to know where the real divisions are, and I think you have properly said it. I often term it a difference between contemporary and classical people, so that contemporary-type thinkers who are very in tune with modern developments and so on often speak a common language, whereas classical-type thinkers speak that same common language. But it's vitally important to locate where the real difference is today. One could imagine, in other words, a reunited church where Presbyterians, Catholics, and all Protestant groups could stay together, could be under the one umbrella of the one Christian church, and the differences in piety and outlook and theology and approaches would then be divided differently. That is, along these lines of progressive and conservative or classical and contemporary, as I'm suggesting.
Yes, you'd have something like the medieval church in which these groups all existed, but managed somehow to keep in touch. They managed to hold hands with each other even when they were arguing.
I guess we call that unity without uniformity, is a
Yes.
sort of summary phrase of that.
Now, there was one other thing in your introductory statement. You talked about the divisions we've had since the Reformation, the last 400 years. Well, the really basic difference, the difference which made the real difference between a united and a divided Christendom came earlier than that. It came between Eastern and Western Christendom, and all too often in Western thinking we ignore Eastern thought, and I think dangerously. I wonder whether there may not be, in the 3 points I have raised and then a couple of the points that you have raised, if there may not be a common issue here to which the Church has got to address itself. I don't mean church in the sense of authority structure. I'm not talking about the reverend and mitred heads at a bishop's conference someplace. I mean the community of Christian people. And I wonder if that community doesn't have to consider anew, all over again, the whole question of difference and dissent within its own boundaries. The idea that the church is going to be a kind of a pure place with no mistakes, a place where there isn't any sin and there isn't any error and there isn't any imperfection, I think that's liable to bring us into a dead-end street. We've got to come to terms with the fact that the day we get a united church, it's going to include all the people whom we now deal with outside. It's going to include people who have a sense of the mystery. It's going to include people who have the kind of pipeline fundamentalist approach to God. It's going to include the somewhat mechanical Sunday Christians. It's going to include people like the woman in the Gospels who was caught in the act of adultery. People whose love of God is sometimes hampered because they love too often and too easily in other directions. They're all going to be there. It's going to include some of the people St. Paul had to quarrel with in Corinth. And one of the things I like to remember, you remember the epistles of St. Clement, One of the points he makes is that the great apostles, Peter and Paul in Rome, were betrayed at the time of the great persecutions by jealousy within the church. These people, whom we tend to revere as absolutely the top men in the extension of the Christian church, wound up facing martyrs' deaths because of division within the body they had gathered and established. Now, that's the kind of thing that the Christians run into. We're not going to deal with any future in the church, ecumenically or otherwise, unless we're prepared to reach out and accept each other with all of this dirt on our faces. If we wait until the time when each of us can see only perfection in the other, I think we're going to wait a long time.
I think that's true. I think in the Second Vatican Council we got a good expression of that when they talked about the church as the pilgrim church, or the sinful church, the church that travels through history, sort of groping its way at times, a church that gets off the track, and in which the members do not always live up to the ideals. I think that Christianity is tremendously realistic for one major reason. We hold the doctrine of original sin. We say that we live in a flawed situation. We're messed up in some way. And that is what always keeps us, it seems to me, floating off into some idealism or adopting some ideology where we're going to have one simple answer to things. So I think you are absolutely right that we do live in a sinful church, and if we're going to talk about getting together again, it's going to be on that basis. That's even part of what we have to do in terms of the Reformation, isn't it? Each of the various groupings is going to have to say, hey, we as a community made some mistakes. We did things wrong. And when we're able to do that, then we understand something of the forgiveness of God, hopefully, but also the tolerance we need to show towards one another. So the new situation, if we're going to get a united church, is going to have to be based on a great deal of tolerance. Tolerance of each other's sinfulness, and also tolerance of the diversity which is there. I know you went back to the split between the East and the West, the thing that has given us the Roman Western Christian world and our Eastern Uniate friends and the Orthodox world. The Orthodox Christians, I think, have so much to offer to the dialogue, and we often don't think about them. It's interesting that one of the theories of our present Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, is that he is making a definite effort to reach out to the Orthodox Christians, that he thinks in terms of trying to bring them back into the one church. One of the theories is that is one of his primary interests these days. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know. But
we have to remember, I'm sure that it is, and I have read one or two of his own statements on this, but we have to remember that an Eastern Christian would phrase it somewhat differently. They would say that the Holy Father is again seriously considering returning to the one church.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have to make allowance for these different perspectives.
No, I think, yes, we do, and it seems to me that maybe we are really closer to union than one might at first blush think. This is Karl Rahner's position, a great German Jesuit theologian who you might have heard of. Rahner's position is that we've got about as much unity as we really need in the new world church that's developing. In other words, that even at the level of the people in the pews and the theological level, we're about arrived. We don't need a whole lot more, because you can't have a whole lot more unity or uniformity or sameness than we currently have. In other words, if you just take within any Christian grouping, say the Catholic world, which I am very familiar with,
surely
there we have progressives, we have conservatives, we have charismatics, we have and you could divide up even more than that, but you at least have these major groupings of people. You already have great diversity in piety, great diversity in theological understanding. So why would we say that we couldn't get a united church where there simply would be this diversity in traditions, where there would be a Lutheran wing, for example, which would preserve many of the important and valid insights that Luther gave us? Why couldn't we have an Anglican union or wing within this larger church that would preserve some of the heritage and greatness of that tradition? In other words, what would be so much different, you see, in a united church that looked like that than what we currently have within the Catholic Church, for example, where we already have this much diversity?
A great Anglican ecumenist of the early part of this century, coming out of the last century, a bishop named Breck, who was very much concerned with these things, said that in his mind the ultimate union of Christendom would be built like a Chinese palace, a number of pavilions joined together by galleries on which people could comfortably move back and forth, but each pavilion retaining more or less its own identity, its own art, its own face, its own outlook.
A really helpful image of how the modern church might look. It seems, I think the theologians are always feeling that it's the leadership that's holding up this process. And a lot of the common people are ready to make a move towards union, and that the theologians have done the work in terms of overcoming most of the problems, although I think there really are some that still remain that we would need more discussion on, but that it's the church leadership that won't do this. I know Hans Kung has written in the past, not that he's in that much great favor with Rome or the Vatican, but he has written in the past about that if we're going to get union, that ultimately the Pope, the Holy Father, is going to in some way or another have to give up some of the power that he has now. That the idea of uniformity or controlling everything from Rome simply can't work anymore. And Karl Rahner himself, I think, is of that opinion, that you cannot write one central law out of Rome anymore that would control all of the various wings of Christianity, or even all of the different geographical groupings within the Catholic community now.
Yes, but you must not forget that the spirit by which one moves to a centralized government is not confined to its most obvious or most apparent institution. There are people in the papal system who do not believe in centralization, who very much want decentralization, and they want it theologically from the standpoint of subsidiarity. They have a good theological reason for it. There are people who would not, under any circumstances, want to be joined or associated with the Pope, who nonetheless have, in the way in which they administer their own religious system, they have a strong desire for centralization. They want easy authority. They want a place at which there will be a clear answer definitely given, to which all will immediately submit. And they're very uncomfortable when they discover a situation in which there may be two answers running parallel and neither one intending to submit to the other.
Don't you think a lot of that has to do with how the authority figure functions? I think back to when Pope John the 23rd was the Holy Father, and
Yes.
and the way he acted, and that idea of embracing other people as brothers and sisters. And I can remember a lot of Protestant people at that time saying, well, when he speaks for me. You know, we could use a leader like that. I think very often in the Protestant world, at the level of the common man in the parish or the person in the pew, that it is a fear of an excessive authoritarianism, of somebody in Rome telling them every move or dictating everything that is to go on in their congregation. It seems to me that's what they fear. They fear that person in Rome taking too much power, or exercising too much control, or acting, in too highfalutin a way. That, you know what I mean? That like he wears these funny clothes, or he gets carried around in a chair, and that kind of thing. When they saw a Holy Father who acted as a servant, I think there was a recognition that maybe we could use someone like that. I mean, obviously, we would make a greater impact on the world as Christians if we had one spokesman that could speak out the gospel ideals and speak for the best insights of the Christian community. I mean, we would be more powerful in the world. We could make a greater impact on the world.
I think that's true enough, but I wonder if perhaps your analysis of the fears of local people may not have gone quite far enough. I don't think they worry about the exotic dress. I think everyone enjoys a little quality of the mysterious, the different, the somewhat exotic in any form of life, and the religious is no exception. I don't think that troubles people. I don't think that people are really that worried about whether the Pope wears a crown or not. There's been a good deal of talk about that at the last coronation of the Pope, or the last investiture. I don't think that's a real issue. I think the problem that the ordinary man sees in the whole question of authority is not so much its theory as rather the practical question, am I going to be heard, or am I simply going to be pushed around? Is somebody going to listen to what I have to say? And I think that this is a pastoral rather than a constitutional issue. And I know that in a world of constitutional bishops, it's quite easy to get a prelate who doesn't listen at all, and no constitution in the world is going to make him do it.
As this gets us down to the practical level of what people are really thinking in the parishes, my own sense is that there are a great many people who don't much care what the hierarchy is saying. They don't much care what bishops are saying, and they're not worried too much about the Pope. I mean, in what way does what the leadership, what they're saying, does it impinge on their daily life? I'm afraid there's many people who have just turned off authority. You know, Andrew Greeley has done that study, which suggests this emergence of what he calls the communal Catholic. Communal Catholic, yes, being the one who takes the tradition seriously, who still goes to church, who says, I'm not going to leave this church, and no one's going to push me out of it. I'm a Catholic, I'm going to remain a Catholic, but who simply is not listening anymore to what the bishops say. Or when the Pope writes an encyclical or makes a statement, it's not that he's mad at the leadership anymore, he's not angry, he simply isn't listening anymore. Now, these communal Catholic people, I think we have a growing number of them. I'm not so sure they're worried about how the authority. Now, I'm just guessing that you have the counterparts to that in other denominations.
I'm sure you have it not only in other denominations. I think you have it in general society as a whole, in the secular world, in the political world, in the corporate world. I think you have a world in which people no longer listen with any confidence to political leaders, to the editors of great newspapers, to the heads of great universities. The general feeling when they hear something propounded by one of these great figures is, oh, heck, do I have to listen to that again? I think that you have, I think, in this matter, put your finger on what may be the most crucial element of the ecumenical picture right now. I think Christendom is ready to go ahead toward union, but it hasn't decided yet who it can follow into the union and beyond. There is, at the moment, a crisis of leadership. It is a crisis of authority, but I'd rather put it on the personal level. It's a crisis of leaders. And I think that happens not only in the church, it happens in the whole Western world, and I think it may be one of the major issues to which Christian people, maybe I should pluralize that, Christian peoples, have got to give their attention.
Do you think that the visit of Pope John Paul II in the United States has bearing on this? I mean, I'm thinking of the way he came across as a charismatic figure, and people look to him as seemingly as the leader. I remember Billy Graham making a statement, something about the real moral leadership in the world has fallen to the Holy Father, and things like that. Perhaps,
I don't think there's any question of that.
People were looking for that, and he sort of functioned that way.
He certainly did.
But what liberal people are saying is that he is going in the other direction and trying to create a uniformity, that it seems as though more and more things come out of Rome that suggest there's one way of doing it. That's the message other people are getting, and that's what I'm hearing from people. So while they like the charismatic element, they like the fact that he is a strong person and a real leader, and I think they like his sense of the human community, that he really loves all people. They fear, again, the uniformity, that somehow joining up with him would mean everyone has to do it the same way. Now, maybe this is one way of looking at this crisis of leadership you're talking about here.
Well, I think that ecumenically speaking, one of the most impressive elements in that visit was an incident that took place in a national shrine at Washington, where he held an ecumenical service, before which one of the nuns, a Roman Catholic nun, confronted him on the matter of women in the priesthood.
Miss Teresa Kane, by name.
I think it was a most impressive thing to others present, and I have heard some of the non-Roman Catholic people who were there who have reflected this, that it was possible for a woman in that situation to confront, I don't think the verb is badly chosen, she confronted the highest authority in the Roman Catholic world, was well received in doing it, her position was not agreed with, and yet she was listened to. And I think that in itself has been a most impressive thing.
Reminds me of the people you opened up this discussion with, talking about Peter and Paul, and the fact that Paul had to withstand Peter to his face.
Yes.
So that throughout the whole of history, we've seen that leadership needed to be confronted, because the leadership can go astray as well or make mistakes. And that in the Christian world, we're really dealing with a community of believers, all of whom are co-responsible for this church, all of whom share the common faith. And if the community is going to be healthy, then there has to be dialogue within the community and among all of the members.
And a willingness to accept mistakes when they are made. There's a tendency on the part of almost everyone to assume that we can be broad-minded about error, except the particular error by which you have hurt me. That's exceptional, and I'm going to get at you for it. Now, that's the spirit we're going to have to set aside.
I say back to the sinful church notion, the pilgrim church wending its way.
You have to accept the fact that error is going to be there, and you have to love the people who are doing it.
Jim, I would say that we live in a world, therefore, where realism has to be the order of the day, where we have to recognize that we live in a sinful world. Original sin is real for us Christians, and we have to learn to accept one another in our weaknesses and in our limitations. We're going to have that as part of any united Christian church we're going to have in the future. The other realistic thing we're going to have to accept is pluralism, the fact that people have different ways of speaking about God. There's different theologies, there are different pieties that exist in our world. And I think the idea of a return to Christendom where everyone would think the same or where uniformity would be expected really cannot be. We can't have that. We really never have had that in the history of the Christian church, and we can't expect to have it in the future. We're going to have pluralism. Now, I think one of our Catholic contributions to all of this is the reminder that it is good to have a spokesman for the Christian group, one around whom we can rally, one who can speak out the gospel ideals and can really function as a world leader for people, a force for moral development in the world, someone who can speak about peace and justice. And I think that maybe we need to keep that in front of ourselves, that the idea of a spokesman is not just abhorrent, the idea of having a major leader is not something we have to get rid of, but that having the leader could really be a positive value for all Christian people.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Jim Troutwine, Episcopal Chaplain at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the modern ecumenical movement. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network in cooperation with the Diocese of Toledo.